We now turn to the second presentation, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Neil Robinson, Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Limerick in the Republic of Ireland. He has an educational background from Portsmouth and University of Exeter. Very strong background on Russian politics. He has written several books about this topic. And again, if I only try to mention one, let me mention a recent publication, Comparative European Politics, Distinctive Democracy, Common Challenges, a book co-edited with Rory Costello by Oxford University Press again in 2020. So a warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think to spare the blushes of the University of Exeter, I should say that I went to the University of Essex rather than the University of Exeter.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No. I just don't want them to take any blame for any errors that I make. You should blame the University of Essex. I'm not going to put up a PowerPoint slide today. I'm not teaching this semester for the first time in 20 years, I think, and I promised myself that I wasn't going to touch PowerPoint the entire semester. So I'm just going to speak. So I was asked to talk about the effect on global governance of hybrid regimes which have elements of populism within them. And I think it's a very interesting question to think about, because as I think we've heard from the previous panels and speakers, generally when we're looking at populism as a threat to global governance, we're thinking about the ways in which there are threats to the liberal international order, which is the sort of the main way through which governance globally gets done, as a threat that comes from sort of two sources. That first of all, there's a threat to globalization as a process. And globalization is one of the drivers for creating global governance because of the demand from economic actors for property rights, for the facilitation of international trade through processes of global trade regulation. And as sort of populism threatens globalization, so it threatens sort of the ability of economic actors to press for the creation of global mechanisms which regulate economic activity. And the second threat to global governance is that populism is a threat to liberalism, and liberalism is the, sort of creates a demand for global governance around certain issues like human rights, and populism is a threat to non-governmental organizations, and non-governmental organizations, sort of are the bodies which, sort of have primarily driven demands for certain forms of global governance. So the idea is very much rooted in the internal threat of populism, that populism, sort of is produced, I think very much as the previous speaker, Professor Wirtz said, in, sort of established democracies, that it's driven by changes domestically in established democracies as globalization losers kick back against the internationalized state, and sort of the extent to which they pose threat to the liberal international order and to the conduct of multilateral global governance practices and institutions is a function of the degree to which sort of they're able to mobilize the economically disadvantaged and the people who've lost out from changes in economic structure as we've moved from industrial to service economies, etc. And it's these, sort of communities that support the sort of the main narratives which have promoted forms of sovereigntism and put them at the forefront of politics in countries like Britain and the United States. That, you know, sort of these are the voters who support, you know, sort of the take back control narrative in the UK, or who support the kind of Trumpian statement, for example, when at the UN in 2018 he said, you know, sort of we'll never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy. Now, this leaves out, you know, sort of many other prospective cases of populism. Sort of, you know, sort of, I don't really want to get into discussions about what populism is. We've already had some of that, and it is a bit of a minefield. But there are cases where, you know, sort of populism has been used by politicians in office in a way that, you know, sort of has exacerbated crises of democracy in some countries, and, you know, sort of has led to those countries becoming more authoritarian. And these are the sort of the cases where hybridization has come about through sort of populists either coming to power and then using their ascent to power to make significant changes to the democratic order, changing regime from democracy to some form of illiberal democracy at best, or form of electoral authoritarianism at worst. And, you know, sort of that, you know, sort of might be the case in somewhere like Venezuela, or Hungary or Poland, with obviously differences in the extent to which they're able to change legal constitutional order, clamp down on opponents, shut down sources of independent media, etc., use the so-called menu of manipulation that facilitates the transformation of a weak democracy into an even weaker democracy, or into some form of soft authoritarian regime. There are also, however, cases of hybrids where politicians have used populist discourse in order to secure power and to consolidate power against challenges. And in these, you know, sort of cases, what you see is the use of a sort of populist logic of social and political antagonism to formulate the basis of legitimate political agency, and to close down political spaces in a way that is benefit to the leadership, and you know, sort of leads to a constriction of political space, and to some form of consolidated authoritarian rule. So I would, you know, sort of disagree slightly with Professor Wirtz that, you know, sort of populism and authoritarianism have nothing to do with one another. I think there is political science literature which shows that where populists come to power, the quality of democracy generally declines, and there are people who use, you know, sort of populist logics in form of, you know, sort of weak ideological rhetoric that centers around, you know, sort of mobilizing on the basis of antagonism between elites and people in order to sort of construct authoritarianism. This should not and is not necessarily always the case of every populist movement that comes to power, or every politician who turns to populism to try and consolidate power, but, you know, sort of it is something which I think we have to allow for happening, both, you know, sort of theoretically, and something that has happened in various places in the world. Now, the latter kind of case of a hybrid regime with some sort of populist elements to it would be the case which I'm most familiar with, Russia. Some other people would argue in the post-Soviet space that the same thing has happened in Kazakhstan prior to the most recent disturbances there, but you know, sort of there have been claims made about it, and that, you know, sort of occurred in Russia at least, sometime after sort of 2011, 2012. And led to the sort of entire reformulation of regime discourse around, sort of notions of what constituted the Russian people and what constituted a legitimate political agency in terms of what the people needed for their representation. It was an alternative vision of democracy, sort of popular democracy rather than liberal democracy, but sort of it sort of clearly cuts down on sort of political pluralism and economic and social pluralism too within the country. Now, these, sort of are not generally, these countries are not generally seen as being threatening to the liberal international order and global governance because, sort of they're generally seen as being peripheral, right? That they are either, sort of economically generally too small, or they are in some sort of revolt against Western modernity, or either, sort of as something that has been sort of coercively exported to them, or as something that sort of they have some sort of long-standing historical objection to, and this sort of is seen as sort of not actually affecting global governance all that dramatically, except insofar as some countries, Russia would obviously be the prime example, sort of have the ability to have major effects on things like the security architecture of Europe and play major roles in certain international organizations like the United Nations. Now, there is, sort of a degree of truth in the argument that, sort of what we're seeing is some form of projection of Western modernity. If the liberal international order is an order that's based on rules rather than based on notions of sort of national hierarchy and sort of brute power, then, sort of the liberal international order is a bad fit for some of these countries, and, sort of they will sort of move away from it and try to sort of influence and restrict its effect upon them. However, I think it's too simple simply to say, sort of that this is some sort of revolt against the West. It is more complicated than that, and the ways in which sort of hybrid states which have some element of populism in their political makeup impact upon the liberal international order is very highly differentiated when we look at it case by case. So, sort of, it partly depends, of course, on the degree of authoritarianism that they are able to affect and the balance that, sort of exists within the hybrid between democracy and authoritarianism and the ways in which populism mediates between populism and authoritarianism and democracy. It is also obviously a function of the amount of sort of hard power that a state has in terms of its military economy and its ability to interact and force its will upon neighbouring states. So the first thing I think we need to do when we're talking about hybrids and international and global governance and the ways in which they fit into the liberal international order is to think of the difference between states which are rule benders and states which are rule breakers or seek to be rule breakers. The rule breakers are countries which sort of endeavour to become the centre of new regional projects economically and potentially in security terms as well. So in the case of Russia, for example, we have the Common Security Treaty Organization, we have the Eurasian Union, Union, and sort of we have this attempt to sort of carve out a zone of influence which sort of lies to some considerable degree outside of the liberal international order, and these organizations in sort of the mind of many Russian members of the Russian elite are institutions which will allow Russia to mediate how member states interact with the liberal international order so that Russia's interests are protected first and it can affect its regime survival. We had a similar sort of process in Venezuela as well with ALBA TCP, the Alliance of the Peoples of, the Bolivarian Alliance of the Peoples of America, the People's Trade Treaty, which sort of gathered Cuba, Bolivia, lots of small Caribbean islands, and originally Ecuador and Honduras, although they subsequently dropped out, and Bolivia's relationship looks a bit rocky, but sort of was a means of extending sort of Venezuelan economic influence into political spheres across the region, because of course all of the member states were primarily interested, as far as I can tell, not being a Latin American expert, primarily interested in getting cheaper oil from Venezuela. The rule benders, on the other hand, sort of are constrained by the fact that there is, still within them some greater degree of relative democracy, by the international commitments that they have made with neighbours who are not sort of going down the same route of regime hybridization, and therefore, sort of their ability to actually establish themselves as, sort of in some larger degree of revolt against the liberal international order is constrained. So Hungary would be, sort of a case in point here, I think. Sort of on the one hand, yes, it is, I think, as Professor Wirtz very neatly described in the case of Mediterranean politics, it sort of is an awkward power, within the European Union, but it and Poland are to some degree constrained. They're constrained by, for example, things like the European Court of Justice ruling, was it the end of last week or earlier this week, which sort of said that kind of they had to uphold the rule of law in order to be in receipt of certain European monies. So there are some constraints on certain kinds of hybrid states, and we can't put them all in the same bracket, no matter how much we'd like to, and no matter how much their leaders' rhetoric would sometimes lead us to believe. The second issue that I think we have to sort of be aware of and take into account is that this is a political revolt rather than an economic revolt. Sort of the problem is politics and how global governance and the liberal international order as sort of regimes which seek to enforce certain standards of political behavior and seek to promote certain kinds of issues in politics as sort of the basis for interaction and the conduction of relations. This is what these states are objecting to, not to the global economy. They wish in many ways to see, sort of global economic interactions unfettered from the political elements of global governance. And they wish certain sort of political issues, or what they would see as political issues, like security, to be uncoupled from, sort of more value-driven politics, which sort of Western states would often claim to be at the heart of their sort of foreign policies and international outlook. And the reason for this is because, sort of these regimes are to some extent all globalized autocracies, as a Russian author living in the United States has put it. They are, sort of more integrated into financial systems and concerned with the ability to sort of trade, take rent, whether that's rent from Europe in the case of Hungary and Poland, both of whom have 3 to 4% of their GDP coming through EU assistance, or take rent through, sort of energy sales in the case of a country like Russia, and, sort of which then wishes to be able to use that money in a variety of different ways in order to sort of level out the booms and slumps that come from being reliant on the production of a primary commodity with a very volatile market, and that requires, sort of your integration into sort of global financial systems. So the extent to which, sort of this is a full revolt against global governance from these countries is, sort of highly varied, according to what kind of hybrid regime you have and the amount of power that you have and your immediate environment and the ways in which you sort of fit into the global economy. So this is a rejection of political globalization and of global governance as the fundamental provision of global public goods in, sort of politics in the first instance, but in the sort of also in the way in which, sort of there is some spillover from political governance into economic governance as well. And sort of this, I think, sort of is an issue that sort of really needs to be confronted, because the standard issue, sort of solution to the populist problem and its threat to the liberal international order is to say, sort out, sort of your problems at home. Right, get rid of the basis for populism in Germany and France and Italy, deal with, sort of the fallout of economic change, restore some sort of global social contract for rich countries by taxing the globally wealthy and supporting social welfare nets in ways that, sort of haven't been done or have been significantly eroded over the last 40 years or so in Western liberal democracies. But that might solve the populist problem in some countries, but it's not going to resolve it in others. And so you're still going to have this threat coming to the liberal international order from other parts of the world, where indeed some of the mechanisms that are used to solve problems in Western liberal democracies might actually exacerbate the causes of populism and rejection of liberal international order elsewhere. I'm not quite sure how long I've spoken for, but I think that probably should be it, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And I think it was very interesting that you also proposed a granular view, that not to treat all kinds of hybridization at face value, but one has to look very carefully. And I think that draws a very nice connection to Professor Wirth's talk. So we have a few minutes for discussion, and I look around for hands being raised who would like to ask a question. Well, you said... I
love it when I get no questions.
Yeah, well, you know, if nobody asks, you know, the bad
means everything I said was
ask
right.
a question, and I'm not sure whether that's better.
Sorry to interrupt you. I couldn't find the button how to raise my hand,
please.
But I thought I could just take the floor.
Please.
It's just a minor question I have for you, Mr. Robinson. First of all, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. And it just crossed my mind when you mentioned new social contracts to counter populism in individual states. And I had to think about if there's a possibility to take it on a bigger scope, let's say EU level or in another international organizations, that we try to kind of reinvent the social contract and try to, not narrow it down to one state, but try to really have it on several levels, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's in some ways part of the implication of what I was coming to at the end. I must admit I haven't kind of followed that thought all the way through, but sort of when we talk about global governance and we're sort of often associating it with liberal international order, we're not really thinking that we think of that as good because it's rule-based, etc. And at some level that's true, but of course those rules were made by a certain set of countries and under certain conditions of power and dominance, and therefore are not necessarily going to be attractive to countries in the rest of the world. Now, some of the objections that they then raise are self-serving objections of not very nice people, and we should not pay them too much mind, but we do need to think about how we deal with let us say, weaker democracies in certain parts of the world who are still struggling to, kind of hang on to democracy. We need to think about how we deal with democracies which are under other kinds of threat, and how we take care of their interests within the liberal international order, rather than, sort of simply thinking that we can go back to the old normal. I think what was it? I forget the phrase that was used this morning by our keynote speaker, but he said something. He had some phrase about returning to the to normality, and that I think is kind of merely going to end up with us repeating history, and history's been pretty awful in many key dimensions, so I'd rather we didn't do that.
Yes, I think we have time for one more question. If you cannot find the button, if it looks similar to my screen, at the bottom there's a row of icons, among them reactions, and if you go there, there is one type of reaction. Raise your hand, and there you should hopefully find it. So do we have another question left? I mean, well, Professor Robinson, you touched on the question whether this populism is more a political or economic development. And I mean, I was wondering if why didn't we have this populist move all over the world before? And it seems to me, at least, there is this correlation to economic problems coming up, right? That globalization, we all see that globalization, economic globalization, cannot go on like it did before. We have the problems of reaching limits, maybe of growth, also ecological limits, fiscal limits, you name it. And so I wonder, as kind of, let's say, wild hypothesis, if we see that, economics cannot deliver anymore, then what do political entrepreneurs do? I mean, they cannot deliver in terms of good economic policy. So they seek other venues to establish themselves. And then we move into these kind of populist political entrepreneurs. Would that be oversimplistic?
No, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I wasn't saying that processes of economic globalization, sort of spread of certain ideas about the organization of economy and the distribution of wealth weren't responsible for the rise of populism. What I was saying is, sort of what do these kinds of populists object to? And they don't object to neoliberalism. They don't object to, sort of the international financial system as one that has lots of holes in it that they can use to move rent around it. But no, I mean, very much, sort of the cause of this was, was very often, sort of liberal economics running out of steam. I mean, if you were to take the cases of Hungary and Poland, sort of it was the destruction of the sort of post-communist social democratic parties, which sort of ended up being responsible for austerity, allowing sort of former liberals to then occupy a political space which blamed all this stuff on out of touch elites following the orders of international financial institutions and causing people to have sort of declining living standards. In the other case, Russia, I mean, it's very much, sort of when did it come about? It came about after the 2008 economic crisis that, sort of caused a crisis of belief and ability to manage an authoritarian political system without adopting and changing the basis upon which political action could happen through rhetoric that then allowed you to demonize and create some sort of populist logic of equivalence between liberal and nationalist forces to sort of outflank them, take them off the political map and consolidate power. So, sort of, I'm not, I'm at one level, sort of having been to the University of Essex and having spent a long time listening to Ernesto Laclau, when it comes to populism, I'm an idealist. But on the other hand, sort of, I've spent most of the rest of my life reading Lenin, and I'm a gross materialist. So I, sort of, I veer between those two positions very much, and I, sort of, I wouldn't want to deny, sort of, the economic basis of these things. I think it's how it feeds into the rise of these movements is different to then what they object to. So, sort of, kind of, there's a lot of writing about, say, sort of post-communist political economy, for example, which would look at places like Hungary, look at places like Russia, and talk about the rise of state capitalism. Well, or sort of economic statism, etc., various combinations of those terms. But these, I don't think, are state capitalist countries. They're not economically statist countries. They are, sort of, well, in Hungary, sometimes people talk about mafia state. We talk about, kind of patrimonial capitalism in Russia, etc., so, sort of where they stand in relationship to sort of populism and nationalism is different.
Well understood. We are already a little bit beyond the curfew, but Ibrahim, you're the organizer, so you can always intervene if it's really important or necessary.
I can sacrifice from my right.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Then thank you very much, Professor Robinson. A very enlightening talk. And